It's really easy to feel frustrated with what feels like broken political discourse at the national level these days. But one member of Congress thinks the solution is to change how we see issues and how we see each other.
Well, it's easy to say, yeah, I vote against every spending bill. It's a lot harder to say, here are my fixes to get us out of this.
On this episode, we sit down with Representative John Curtis of Utah's 3rd Congressional District. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This episode of Defending Ideas is brought to you by Zions Bank, sponsor of the 2024 Sutherland Institute Congressional Series. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week I'm excited to talk with Representative John Curtis about a range of issues affecting our politics today, and we're going to dive into some of those questions right now. And just want to remind listeners that these episodes are in connection with the 2024 Sutherland Congressional Series, sponsored by Zions Bank, and we're so grateful to have this time with our elected officials. Representative Curtis, thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's fun to be with you.
I want to dive in. So you spoke at our congressional series recently, and the theme I thought was really fascinating because you kind of had this idea of, well, let's rethink our politics. I think you used the term reinvent the wheel, but try a square. To me, it kind of screamed reset. We need to change some things in a positive way. Can you just elaborate on that theme a little bit?
Yeah, it is a reset, but I also wanted to highlight that we needed to see things differently. That's why let's reinvent the wheel, but this time try a square, because nobody would suggest that's a good idea. But a lot of our good ideas come from things that originally sounded like a really bad idea. And I'm challenging people to just view things a little bit differently and be willing to try some things that may not sound off the top of the head like it's going to work.
Did this come from a place of there obviously is something wrong in our national political discourse? There's too much contempt and anger and polarization. Did it what motivated you to say, we need to see things a little differently because what we're doing maybe isn't always working?
Yeah, and there's that. I will also say it's kind of an internal thing with me and my team that we're committed to be different. And sometimes that's hard. People don't like to see different. It's uncomfortable. But there's a real commitment on our part to look at things differently and try things differently.
I want to tease out one example. So it's at our Congressional Series event. We'll link to the video in our show notes if anyone wants to go back and rewatch that.
It's quite a highlight. I would have them watch the whole thing. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and thanks to you, of course, for the participation. Our congressional delegation is always great to have and interact with voters and especially a lot of students up at the U and our partnership with Hinckley Institute. But you mentioned a specific example of this that I want to kind of talk about in terms of elected officials communicating with constituents. Sometimes I think voters can feel some angst there. It's easy to throw up your hands and say, well, nobody listens to me. I can't really make a difference at the federal level. It's easy to feel really jaded about politics. But you told a story of changing how you did town halls. And that sounds like kind of just a logistical thing. But I think it speaks to this broader point of improving our dialogue, and voter to elected officials, one of those most important relationships. So can you tell that story? And then I want to talk about what was the impact of it.
So for decades, a town hall has been very traditional. I stand before 100 people. They fire questions at me. I give my answers back. And it's good, but it can be better. And usually what happens is 1 or 2 or 3 people kind of dominate the dialogue. And you get a lot of people that come and never got a chance to answer their question, or we spend a half hour on somebody's issue that's not everybody's issue. And I'm always frustrated because if there's 100 people, there's 50 hands up in the air. How do I know who to call on and whose turn it is? And I found all that very frustrating. I came back one day and announced to my team, I'm not going to do these ever again. And I caught them off guard a little bit, but I wanted to force the square answer, right? Like, let's look at this differently. And so I said, hey, look, I'm not going to take questions anymore. Well, that sounds like a square wheel, right? Like, how can you do a town hall and not take questions? And by the way, we're never going to call it town halls again. We call them community outreach meetings, because I wanted to demonstrate to my team that we're not going to do this anymore. So the format that we came up with is I'll speak for about 15 minutes about what I'm working on in Washington because I want to share that. People want to hear that. And then we break up into groups, and I bring my whole team with me. So we have passport experts, we have visa experts, we have VA export experts, and every kind of issue that my constituents have, we bring an expert for that. If you want to suggest legislation, we have somebody. And they spread around the room with tables, and people can go visit those tables. And then I take 5-minute meetings with people for 90 minutes. So for 90 minutes, I take people 5 minutes at a time. And they can say to me anything they want. They can ask me anything they want. And they find it remarkably refreshing compared to that fighting with everybody else to get a little slice of my time. And I ask them inevitably, I always say, do you like this better? And I've never had anybody say, no, they've clearly said this is better. And I think that's just a really good example of if you had just said, boy, you're going to do a town hall and not take questions, that will never work.
And there's something you're touching on that I want to expand on a little bit, and it reminds me of in some previous roles I worked in local government at the Salt Lake County level, and on occasion I would have people call in and complain about something, various constituents that we interacted with. The thing that I noticed was if I just sort of let them vent for a while and try to answer their questions and ask some clarifying questions, even at the end of the conversation, if it wasn't a problem that we could solve, or maybe even if we disagreed with the approach they were suggesting, most of the time, their anger kind of went away because they just wanted to feel heard.
Yeah, so imagine one-on-one looking me in the eye for 5 minutes and telling me your frustration. You're exactly right. A lot of people, they didn't really come to ask me a question. They came to tell me how they feel about something. And I don't know the numbers, but I'll bet at least half don't have a question, but they want to tell me something.
And it seems like that, I feel like that creates sort of the framework for the broader theme in our politics. That is, as you mentioned, when you go to town halls and there are some who want to make a lot of noise and maybe are frustrating for the other participants, do you think that's almost a microcosm of our broader politics, that most people just want to make sure their elected officials are hearing and understanding their concerns? And maybe there's a minority of folks who really are looking for a platform to perform. This kind of ties back to a lot of the work of Yuval Levin from American Enterprise Institute, his work on institutions, that our society, our culture today is so performative rather than formative. And so I wonder if you have seen this sort of new town hall model better serve the needs of constituents who just want to feel heard and maybe not giving as much airtime to the folks who just want a platform upon which to perform. Is that a distinction that you've seen?
Black and white, yes, a clear distinction. Interestingly, I kind of know who the people are, and guess what? They don't sign up for the 5-minute interview because that's not what they wanted. They wanted to be in front of a crowd, making a point, trying to make me look bad or trying to make their point, and it totally takes away from them what they came for when you say, not everybody else gets to hear you, only me.
Well, one of the other themes, you referenced a quote or a concept from President Ronald Reagan, that, and I'm not going to get it exactly, so you might or our listeners may correct me on it, but essentially the principle of if you agree with me 80% of the time, you're not my 20% enemy, you're my 80% friend. And you referenced that in your talk at our congressional series. I want to ask you to expand on that. What does that mean today? It seems to go toward the spirit of common ground. Is that principle still alive and well today, and how do you apply it?
It's on life support, and the reason it is too many of our constituents see the 20% and get very, very angry at the 20%. They don't see the 80%. And too many of my colleagues, in my opinion, it's the easy way out to blame the 20% why I won't vote for this. I can find something in every bill not to vote for, but it's a little bit harder to say, you know what, let me show you the 80% that I saw, and now let's have a thoughtful conversation about, that 20% that neither you or I liked, why I was willing to deal with that. And the reality of it is sometimes I'll vote against a bill because there's 20% I don't like, but what I don't like is so strong that I can't take the 80%.
It seems to me that there's this reframe, this sort of square approach, as you've called it, and talking about this concept of the 80% rule from Ronald Reagan. What I want to ask is, this screams for sort of a renewal of, yes, robust debate and disagreement, but finding common ground where we can act together, But does it feel like people want that? Are voters hungry for that and just not being heard, or do we still need to do some work to get there?
I would say that what I'm proposing is a lot harder, both for the representative and for the constituent. It is so easy to just say, look, that's not going to work, and here's why, and then we're done. Well, guess what? We never solved the problem. And immigration, you can throw out problem after problem, budget, deficit, all those things that we never really solve. Well, it's easy to say, yeah, I vote against every spending bill. It's a lot harder to say, here are my fixes to get us out of this.
Let's dive into some of the issues that maybe can be an example of this approach. A year ago, you came on the show. We talked about the Conservative Climate Caucus, and you gave a great overview of sort of the principled framework and the approach of the work you were doing with your colleagues in that caucus. Now, a year later, can you give us a status report? What's the work of the caucus looking like today? What's on trajectory?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things that I use as a benchmark to see how we're doing. One was there's an international climate conference that Republicans never went to because we hated climate, right? And I started going and started taking some colleagues. And on the last one I went to, I was on a panel. And there was a Democrat on the panel. And he stopped the panel and he said, wait a minute. I'm here at a climate caucus, and there's one Democrat and two Republicans on this panel. And we all got a kick out of that. But the point is that a Republican voice was being heard and was being outrepresented 2-1. We were outrepresenting 2-1. And I think moments like that are when I say, you know what, this is resonating, that we should be speaking up and talking about our approach. I think another really important signal is in the committee I'm on, Energy and Commerce. We talk about energy a lot. And it used to be when climate came up that it just divulged to a debate about the science, and nobody ever won that debate. Now today, when climate comes up, Republicans, instead of defaulting to that, default to say, let us tell you our solutions. And it's here again, obviously a much better look for Republicans and a much more thoughtful debate.
Can you recap for our listeners, what do some of those solutions look like in your mind? What's being discussed at the Conservative Climate Caucus that you think can hopefully have some broad, again, 80% appeal across the board? So
the reality of it is the market is driving this. A lot of times people say, oh, government, is driving this climate movement. The market is, and you can step back and actually see how the market's ahead of government on this. And what the market wants is affordable energy, reliable energy, and clean energy. And that's what's driving it. And so if you think about, well, how would Republicans satisfy affordable, reliable, clean? We're really good at affordability and reliability, but we don't talk about clean. But wait a minute, nuclear, 100% clean. Geothermal, 100% clean. We brought this up in last year's podcast. Our fossil fuels burn far cleaner than those abroad. We could reduce more greenhouse gas emissions by exporting U.S. natural gas to replace Russian natural gas than any part of the Green New Deal. And so what Republican can't get excited about that? Hydrogen, emerging technologies. These are all really exciting for Republicans. And by the way, most of those things my Democratic colleagues agree with.
You're reminding me of another sort of principled framework. So when you say affordable, reliable, and clean, and you've spoken about this a number of times, you mentioned in your talk at our series that you spoke at a Sutherland event to sort of help launch this effort. But those, I think it's really important to focus on the principle framework. And as you outline, affordable, reliable, and clean, that seems to be the basis from which you message and then you rally support across the board. And to your point, it's maybe hard for anyone to agree with those principles, but I also think it gives an opportunity for people across the political spectrum to see something that they can at least get interested in, if not excited about. Have you seen that kind of laying it out in terms of, here are the key principles we all care about. Now let's have a discussion about the policy mechanisms that can align with these principles. Has that been helpful in winning people over to that issue or any other issue if you use that framework across the board?
Absolutely. And notice we didn't talk about science, because the moment I say science, people are going to split up and now we're going to have a debate that nobody's going to win. Right. And instead, let's talk about market forces. Let's talk about those types of things. Let's talk about Republicans' inherent desire to leave the earth better than we found it. By the way, that's not just Republican. And that's a very different conversation.
There's a statement from Arthur Brooks, who we reference often on the show. We're a big fan of his work.
Yeah.
Right. And he talks about, I think it was actually a New York Times opinion piece a number of years ago, or for one of the major publications, where he essentially says on issues of poverty and upward mobility, folks on the right and left kind of need each other, because there's a perception out there that folks on the left care more about poverty, but folks on the right really love the free market system. And he was kind of arguing, well, what if you combine those two values, say we really love free enterprise and we really want people in poverty to be empowered to escape and earn a better life for themselves. You combine these two values and it becomes really powerful. Is that the kind of thing you're seeing or hoping to see on this issue of the Conservative Climate Caucus and the work?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy, and I do believe that without a Republican approach, you get off track on climate, and Europe's a really good example. There was nobody pushing back when Europe said we're going to eliminate nuclear. There was nobody pushing back when Europe said no fracking. Well, today they buy fracked natural gas from an enemy. And I think that's a really good example where a Republican voice at the table to say, whoa, wait a minute, that's a really bad idea, is good. And I think, if we're honest as Republicans, over the decades and decades, it's been good to challenge the clean portion of it. We can all see examples, think of the old coal towns where there was, that much coal dust all over everything and wasn't healthy. And so I think it's valuable to have people reminding us, clean is important, and you don't have to legislate it. By the way, the market wants clean.
I remember when we talked last year about this issue on the previous episode of Defending Ideas with you, the name was very intentional. Conservative Climate Caucus. I mean, obviously caucus in D.C. You
right, it means something to us, but not here in Utah necessarily.
But you very intentionally wanted to have conservative in there, and obviously connected to climate. Can you talk about that? And then does that lead you to any thoughts about the state of the conservative movement today?
So, first of all, let me say we spent a lot of time on the name. I was told over and over and over again, don't use the word climate, because Republicans don't like to talk about climate. Well, what I could see that they couldn't is back in Washington, D.C., if you don't use the word climate, you don't get a seat at the table. I knew that, and I knew if we didn't use climate, there are other caucuses that try to deal with this from a Republican perspective. Nobody's ever heard of them. Nobody cares. The fact that we were willing to use climate was very, very important from a branding. But we wanted to be very clear, no, this is a conservative perspective. This is not a Green New Deal perspective. This is from conservatives. We're not going to ask you to leave your conservative credentials at the door to be part of this. And it's been a really good combination of words that has just worked. By the way, the Conservative Climate Caucus, the CCC, works really well as well. We now have the Conservative Climate Summit and other things that have spawned off of that. There's a Conservative Climate Foundation, and it's growing.
One of the things I'm really interested in is if the progress you've been making on this issue with this framework and this approach as you've outlined, can that be replicated to other issues? And if you already are, let's talk about that. But this idea of we get our core principles on paper, we lead with those, and as you just said, telling folks, hey, we don't have to leave our conservative values at the door. We want to bring those to the table, but in a spirit of real discussion and finding common ground. Can that work on other issues? I
want to think so. Yeah, I hope so. I've brought this up with my team, and I'll scare them. I'll say, hey, should we do the same thing with immigration? Right? And that's scary because we've seen people jump into that. But somebody needs to take immigration for conservatives and be thoughtful about our solutions. And what we did with climate was we said what we didn't like. And we're also kind of good with that with immigration. I can tell you what we don't like. Well, what do we like? What would we support? What's in line with conservative values? And I think the more that we can do that and not be afraid to talk about it. And the reality of it is, let's face it, I took some pretty strong political risk when I said, I'm going to talk climate. When I went to Sutherland a couple of years ago and said, I'm going to talk climate, everybody would have advised me not to do that, right? You're not going to have a future as a Republican if you're talking climate. And we face that same thing with these other topics, is by just putting your toe in, everybody's going to try to knock your head off. And we've got to have people with the confidence to say, no, I'm going to go explore things. And by the way, when I started this climate thing, I didn't know where it was going. You have to be willing to say, I'm going to step into this. I'm going to take some risk. I'm going to have some dialogue, and I'm going to find that conservative spot, let's just say on immigration, where instead of saying what we don't like, we can go really hard and proud with, yes, but this is what we do like.
In recent months here at Sutherland Institute, we issued a new statement of principles, and our mission statement and a vision statement that largely consistent with who we are as an organization. But we added some language in a couple of places, in particular, to outline a statement of principles that we think are at the core of the American experiment, what it means to love America, and also are very much exemplified by Utah and the way things happen here in Utah, the way we do policy and governance and everything. And that set of principles, whatever label people apply to it, I'm very interested in that sort of being successful. It's successful here in Utah. We want it to be successful everywhere. When you look at the future and you think of, okay, if conservatives can have a space on climate issues or immigration issues, where would you like to see the trajectory of conservatism go in relation to other tough issues that maybe we can try and fix?
I love this question because I've given it a lot of thought. And you can imagine as a candidate, I've been a candidate for the U.S. Senate, and you go through the caucus meetings and you go through all the Lincoln Day dinners and the county conventions. You're pressed a lot with, like, what kind of Republican are you? Are you a rhino, right? Like, everybody wants to, like, they're looking for, like, under the hood, like, is there any chance you're a rhino? And, like, we'll try to define that term and try to define, like, Republican and conservative. And I was recently interviewed, and people said, well, are you a moderate? Or, the people interviewing me were trying to, like, nail me down for what I was. And I said, like, none of those titles fit me. And they finally said, well, what does fit you? And I said, I'm normal. And we all got a laugh out of that. But then I thought, okay, well, what is normal? And I've spent a lot of time on that. Now, normal for me is what I would call a Utah traditional conservative. I grew up in Salt Lake City with a very traditional Republican family. My first president I voted for was Ronald Reagan. And I would have never thought that I couldn't articulate, well, like, what is that Republican? And some people, I think, misinterpret it because back in Washington, if you're not really objective and a fighter, and if you're not blowing things up, you're not conservative. Well, nobody stops to say, well, what are you blowing up? Is it for a conservative value, right? It's more, did you blow it up? Oh, you're a good conservative, right? And if you don't, you're a rhino. And so the best thing I've been able to do, and I'm trying to articulate this better and spend more time on it, is to tie this back to the roots of Utah and our pioneer heritage. And that, to me, is what I grew up trying to emulate. So let's talk about independence, patriotic. You work hard. Hard work brings reward. Risk is rewarded. A lot of these things that, as I grew up, that I identified as Republican, but I think actually came from our pioneer roots. So more and more, I'm trying to tie back what is conservative to our pioneer heritage and spend more time studying and trying to think, what was it about the values, family, God, right, that they taught us that really, I think, are transcend rhino or moderate, right, or these different terms.
I think there's a lot of potential for them to transcend all political lines. That if you look at, at the core of Sutherland Institute is a commitment to the values of faith, family, and freedom. And as we outlined, what freedom looks like in the way this country was set up through our founding documents, and the value of free enterprise and family as an institution and religious freedom, and all of those things that have made America what it is and have helped make Utah what it is. That should be the kind of thing that ought to be broadly popular across the board. You're right. And I couldn't help, when you said those three things, you know what I thought of? Pioneers: faith, family, and freedom. They came here for freedom, for religious freedom. You talk about families, tight families. Well, and without their faith, they would have never come or never made it. And then I do think, because I've thought about this too, is like, those aren't Republican or Democrat. Those, I call them Utah values, right? And I think that that's not necessarily a party so much as it is what I would call core Utah values. I want to ask it, in the time we have left, these values, I think sort of the principles discussion is vital, and we too often skip it over when we're talking about various issues as voters, with elected officials, as a society. We just jump right to sort of the meat of the issue, and I think we shouldn't bypass the importance of what are our principles? What's the framework through which we're going to approach this issue? So I appreciate that discussion, but I also want to ask you then, how do you apply it? And what I mean by that is, are there specific issues that you're working on in Washington, D.C. right now that you feel like you're able to sort of bring this value set and hopefully make a difference? But what's top of mind for you in terms of the issues that maybe these values can help improve in terms of our national debates?
Well, I think you could apply them to every single one. And for instance, if you go to climate, I built this on the fact that Utahns care deeply about the earth and they want to leave it better than they found it. Not on the science, not on greenhouse gas emissions, but on that core basis. And I think if you go to, a number of years ago, we did the Utah Compact about immigration, families, keeping families together, the right to be able to come to this country legally and do this right. I think all of those principles can be seen in every issue.
I want to start to wrap things up with, I told you before we started recording, I love ending these episodes on a tone of optimism or hopefulness, because I think it is so easy for all of us to at times just feel really jaded with politics. We look at the debates happening on social media and in the mainstream press, and it's easy to think, what a mess. I just want to ignore it and just kind of just try to not engage with it at all. And I totally understand where people are coming from when they get frustrated or tired of it. But I want to ask you, how do you feel about the future of the country? I mean, we're obviously in some unique times, but are you hopeful for the future of the United States? And if so, why?
The answer is yes. And why? I wish I could take all of your listeners with me to Washington, D.C. And what you would see in my day-to-day work are hundreds of my colleagues working hard, working across the aisle, finding solutions on values, built on values. And yes, sometimes we see values differently, but a good, thoughtful debate about values. And that happens far more than people realize, because you don't see that on social media. It's boring. It's not sexy, right? You see the when I yell at a colleague, if I yelled at him, that would be on social media, that'd be on cable news. But if I sit down with a colleague and we work out a solution, that's boring. And so I would tell your listeners, there's a lot more of that going on than they get to see.
To some extent, is it just human nature that we're drawn to conflict more than...
Such a good way to say it. And sadly, that's true. We always kind of see the worst. We always expect the worst. And there's a lot of good going on that people don't get to see in Washington.
Well, Congressman, before we wrap up, is there anything else on your mind? Any final thoughts you want to share with our audience, with Utah voters, as far as the major issues you've been working on in D.C.? What are you looking at next? Any progress you're hoping to make?
I'll just say one of the biggest issues facing our country right now is permitting reform. Just to get into the weeds just slightly, that's how projects sell through and get approved or not. And right now, every project, no matter how good or how bad, cannot get approved. A nuclear facility, a wind farm, an oil pipeline, and it's all because it's being bogged down in weaponizing what used to be used to keep our environment and our air clean has all been weaponized. So we've got to plow through that, or we're not going to really reach any of our objectives for the environment or for energy. That's one of the biggest things that I'm working on. The other thing, in closing, I'd just say I hope people realize what a great honor I feel it is to serve this state. We are so lucky from the state. I think we should never forget what a great state we have. We can have good debates about values here, but our core values are stunning here, and I wish we could have spread them across the country.
I agree. Utah is a special place. We need to bring a little more of Utah to Washington.
Absolutely, yeah.
Representative, thank you so much for your time. Yeah. We'll have to do this again soon.
I hope so.
That was Congressman John Curtis. We're going to take a quick break, but more defending ideas right after this. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there's a couple key takeaways from our conversation with Representative Curtis that I captured in my notes that I think can help each of us, that we can essentially use this as a model. Anytime we're talking about an issue with anyone, especially if we're debating it, if we're discussing something with someone who has a totally different view than ours. And here's what I think we can do. Use this as a model. Start by articulating your values, your core principles that guide how you see the issue, and do it proactively and genuinely, earnestly. Don't use it as a bludgeon to sort of beat up on the person you're talking with, saying, well, I believe this and you don't, so therefore you're bad. Instead, frame it as, these are the things that I really believe in a positive, aspirational way. These are the values that I'm striving towards in terms of the way I view this issue. If you start there and articulate your deeply held values, your core guiding principles, then ask the other person how that resonates with them, where they might find alignment with those. I guarantee you most of the time, you're going to find some alignment on those core principles. And then that means you're operating from a place of shared ground, of common ground. You have sort of a shared foundation from which to talk about the issue. You may not always agree ultimately, but it can help make things a little bit less adversarial if we start from this principled framework and then invite a conversation about how best to live up to those principles. That's kind of what I take away from Representative Curtis and how he's approached the climate issue, laying out those core principles and then inviting others into the fold based on those principles as well to try and find some real common ground solutions. And I really think it could be applied to probably a range of issues that we grapple with in our public policy debates. Well, that is it for this episode. I hope that you have enjoyed our discussion and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the principles we talked about today. I want to remind you, if you like what you heard today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the show on any of the major podcast platforms, wherever you like to listen, like Apple, Spotify, or if you want to watch the program on YouTube or the social media platforms, just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops. That's every Tuesday morning. Again, all of that and more at defendingideas.org. And also, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, in particular, if you want more conversations like this, more events, more research, more analysis that can help make sound ideas broadly popular, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. I also want to thank the sponsor of this episode and the 2024 Sutherland Congressional Series, Zions Bank. Very grateful to their support for these important discussions we're having with our elected officials. That'll do it for this episode. Thanks for being with us. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.